The aircraft carrier, USS Enterprise, steamed through the pre-dawn darkness of December 7, 1941, approximately 200 miles west of Pearl Harbor, her flight deck crew preparing to launch the morning's first patrol aircraft. Vice Admiral William Halsey stood on the flag bridge watching preparations with growing unease that he couldn't quite articulate, but that experienced naval officers learned not to ignore. Enterprise and her task force had departed Pearl Harbor on November 28th to deliver Marine fighter aircraft to Wake Island, a routine mission that should have seen them return to port days earlier. But bad weather had delayed their return, and now, on this Sunday morning, they were still at sea when Halsey's instincts told him something felt wrong about the general situation, even though he had no specific intelligence suggesting immediate danger. At 06:01 p.m. hours, Enterprise began launching 18 SBD Dauntless dive bombers for a routine morning search patrol that would scout ahead of the task force as it approached Oahu. The aircraft would fly search patterns radiating outward from the carrier's position, then proceed individually to Ford Island Naval Air Station at Pearl Harbor, rather than returning to the ship, a standard practice when the carrier was close enough to port that recovering aircraft at sea made no operational sense. The pilots climbed into bright morning sunshine, formed up, and headed toward their assigned search sectors, expecting nothing more eventful than a few hours of routine patrol flying, followed by landing at Ford Island and perhaps some shore leave while Enterprise completed her return to port. Lieutenant Commander Halstead Hopping led one section of Enterprise aircraft eastward toward Oahu, maintaining radio silence as doctrine required during routine operations. At approximately 8:08 hours, still more than 50 miles from Pearl Harbor, Hopping and his pilots saw massive columns of black smoke rising thousands of feet into the air from the direction of the harbor. The initial assumption was that some terrible accident had occurred, perhaps an ammunition ship exploding or fuel storage facilities burning, disasters that periodically struck naval installations despite stringent safety precautions. As they drew closer, the radio filled with frantic transmissions that made clear this was no accident, but an attack by Japanese aircraft that were bombing and torpedoing ships moored in the harbor. Hopping and his unarmed SBD dive bombers, configured for search patrol rather than combat with no bombs and minimal ammunition for their defensive machine guns, found themselves flying into the middle of the Pearl Harbor attack with no way to effectively fight back, and with Japanese fighters suddenly appearing among them, firing on American aircraft that couldn't adequately defend themselves. Several Enterprise aircraft were shot down by Japanese Zeros within sight of Pearl Harbor, the pilots dying before they understood what was happening or why Japanese aircraft were attacking American territory. Other Enterprise pilots managed to reach Ford Island and land amid the chaos of burning ships and continuing Japanese attacks. Their aircraft often shot full of holes, but somehow still flying despite damage that should have been fatal. Aboard Enterprise, steaming westward away from Oahu, radio operators monitoring transmissions from Pearl Harbor heard the attack developing in real time through fragmentary reports and urgent calls for help. Admiral Halsey immediately ordered the carrier to general quarters and launched all available fighters to defend against possible Japanese attack on the task force itself. The entire ship's company understood within minutes that the United States was at war and that they had narrowly avoided being in port when the attack occurred. Had Enterprise returned on scheduled days earlier, she would have been moored at Pearl Harbor that Sunday morning, and likely would have been sunk or heavily damaged in the first minutes of the attack before her crew could mount effective defense. The weather delays that had seemed frustrating during the voyage now appeared to have saved the ship through pure chance. Enterprise had been commissioned in May 1938 as the 7th American aircraft carrier and the second of the Yorktown class, ships that represented the United States Navy's mature understanding of carrier design. After years of experimentation with converted battlecruiser hulls and purpose-built carriers that had revealed what worked and what didn't in carrier operations. At 827 feet long and displacing 25,500 tons at full load, Enterprise was large enough to operate substantial air groups of fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers while possessing sufficient speed, over 32 knots, to keep pace with fast battleships and to maneuver rapidly during flight operations or when evading enemy attack. The ship's distinctive island superstructure rose from the starboard side of the flight deck, containing bridge facilities, command spaces, radar equipment, and the smokestack that vented boiler exhaust from the engineering spaces deep in the hull. 3 elevators connected the hangar deck to the flight deck above, allowing aircraft to be moved between levels for maintenance, rearming, and launch operations. 8 5-inch guns mounted in single turrets provided anti-aircraft defense, along with numerous smaller automatic weapons that would be continuously upgraded throughout the war as the importance of anti-aircraft defense became increasingly apparent through hard experience. Enterprise's air group in December 1941 consisted of approximately 90 aircraft divided among 3 squadrons. Fighting Squadron 6 flew F-4F Wildcat fighters responsible for defending the carrier from enemy aircraft and for escorting strike missions. Bombing Squadron 6 operated SBD Dauntless dive bombers that could deliver 1,000-pound bombs with reasonable accuracy against ships or land targets. Torpedo Squadron 6 flew TBD Devastator torpedo bombers, carrying aerial torpedoes for attacks against ships, though these aircraft would prove tragically vulnerable in combat and would eventually be replaced by more capable successors after suffering catastrophic losses during the Battle of Midway. The crew numbered approximately 2,200 officers and enlisted men responsible for operating the ship, maintaining her complex machinery and systems, servicing and arming the aircraft, and performing the countless specialized tasks required to keep a carrier functioning during sustained operations. Aircraft carriers were the most complex warships ever built up to that time, requiring coordination among dozens of separate departments and specialties, ranging from navigation and engineering to aviation maintenance and ordnance handling. The crew had trained together for years, developing the skills and teamwork that would be tested repeatedly during the coming war. Admiral Halsey kept Enterprise and her escorts at sea following the Pearl Harbor attack, patrolling waters west of Hawaii, searching for the Japanese carrier force that had launched the attack and hoping to intercept them during their withdrawal. The Japanese carriers were never found despite extensive searches because they had approached from the north and withdrew rapidly along a different route after recovering their aircraft. The failure to locate and engage the Japanese carriers frustrated Halsey intensely, but the searches kept Enterprise away from the devastation at Pearl Harbor and allowed her to avoid the organizational chaos that consumed Pearl Harbor's repair facilities as they struggled to assess damage and begin recovery operations. Enterprise finally returned to Pearl Harbor on December 8th, and her crew saw for themselves the destruction that Japanese aircraft had inflicted during their 2-hour attack the previous morning. 8 battleships had been sunk or seriously damaged, 3 light cruisers and 3 destroyers had been hit, and nearly 200 aircraft had been destroyed on the ground or in the air. More than 2,400 Americans had been killed, with over 2,100 wounded. The harbor still reeked of burning oil from ruptured fuel bunkers and shattered vessels. Bodies were still being recovered from sunken ships. The devastating effectiveness of the Japanese attack was immediately apparent to anyone who saw the harbor, and the implications for carrier warfare were equally obvious. Aircraft carriers had proven they could strike devastating blows against naval bases and ships that previously had been considered safe behind harbor defenses. Enterprise departed Pearl Harbor again on December 9th to search for Japanese submarines reported operating near the Hawaiian Islands, beginning a pattern of nearly continuous operations that would characterize the ship's service throughout the war. While other carriers spent weeks or months in port between deployments, undergoing maintenance and giving their crews rest, Enterprise would spend most of the next 4 years at sea conducting combat operations with only brief intervals in port for essential repairs and resupply. The ship's near-constant operational tempo would earn her the nickname the Big E and a reputation as the hardest-working carrier in the Pacific Fleet. The first 6 months of the Pacific War saw Enterprise conducting numerous operations as American forces attempted to slow Japanese advances across the Pacific while building up strength for eventual counteroffensives. In February 1942, Enterprise aircraft struck Japanese installations on Kwajalein and other Marshall Islands atolls in raids designed more to boost American morale than to achieve significant military objectives. The raids demonstrated that American carriers could strike back against Japanese-held territory, but they also revealed how difficult carrier operations were and how much coordination was required for successful strikes against defended targets. The Doolittle raid in April 1942 saw Enterprise providing escort for the carrier Hornet, which had been loaded with Army Air Force B-25 medium bombers for a daring one-way strike against Tokyo and other Japanese cities. The raid was launched earlier than planned after Japanese picket boats detected the task force, forcing the B-25s to take off while still over 600 miles from Japan, rather than at the planned 400-mile distance that would have improved their chances of reaching safe landing sites in China after bombing their targets. Enterprise fighters and bombers provided combat air patrol protecting both carriers during the approach and withdrawal, and Enterprise aircraft sank the picket boat that had reported the American task force's position. The Doolittle raid achieved minimal physical damage to Japanese targets, but provided an enormous psychological boost to American morale by demonstrating that Japan itself was vulnerable to American air attack less than 5 months after Pearl Harbor. For the Japanese military and government, the raid was profoundly shocking and embarrassing, revealing that their homeland defenses were inadequate and that American carriers could approach close enough to launch attacks before being detected. The raid directly contributed to Japanese decisions to extend their defensive perimeter eastward by seizing Midway Island, setting in motion the chain of events that would lead to the Battle of Midway in June 1942. Enterprise was at sea heading toward the Coral Sea when the Battle of the Coral Sea occurred in early May 1942. And she missed participating in the first naval battle where opposing fleets never came within visual range of each other and where all the fighting was conducted entirely by carrier aircraft. The battle demonstrated both the potential and the limitations of carrier warfare, with both sides suffering significant aircraft losses and with the American carrier, Lexington, being sunk after taking bomb and torpedo hits that started fires her crew couldn't contain. Enterprise continued toward the battle area but was recalled when it became clear that Japanese forces were withdrawing and that American forces in the Coral Sea area didn't need reinforcement. The Battle of Midway in early June 1942 would prove to be the defining moment not just of Enterprise's war, but of the entire Pacific War, the battle where American carrier forces decisively defeated a Japanese operation aimed at drawing out and destroying the American carrier fleet while capturing Midway Island to extend Japan's defensive perimeter eastward. American code-breaking had provided advance warning of Japanese intentions, allowing Admiral Chester Nimitz to position his available carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, northeast of Midway, to ambush the Japanese carrier force when it approached the island. Enterprise and the other American carriers launched their strikes on the morning of June 4th, after search planes located the Japanese carrier force approximately 200 miles southwest of the American position. The attacks were poorly coordinated due to communication failures and the general chaos of trying to manage multiple aircraft types with different speeds and ranges, all attempting to strike the same target simultaneously. Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise, along with torpedo squadrons from the other two American carriers, attacked the Japanese carriers without fighter escort after communications breakdowns and navigational errors separated the slow torpedo bombers from the fighters that were supposed to protect them. The TBD Devastators were slaughtered by Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire, with Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet losing all 15 aircraft and torpedo squadron. 6 from Enterprise losing 10 of 14 aircraft without scoring a single torpedo hit on Japanese ships. The sacrifice of the torpedo bombers, while tactically futile, drew Japanese fighters down to low altitude and disrupted Japanese carrier operations at the critical moment when Enterprise and Yorktown dive bombers arrived overhead at high altitude to begin their attacks. The Japanese carriers, with their fighters at low altitude pursuing American torpedo bombers, and with their flight decks crowded with armed and fueled aircraft being prepared for strikes against the American carriers, were devastatingly vulnerable to the dive bombing attacks that began at approximately 10:20 hours. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading Enterprise's dive bombers, had continued searching beyond the point where his fuel status dictated he should turn back, gambling that the Japanese carriers had to be somewhere in the general area, even though they weren't where expected. His persistence was rewarded when he spotted a Japanese destroyer racing northward and correctly deduced that the destroyer was likely heading back toward the main Japanese fleet after investigating something. McCluskey followed the destroyer's course and found the 4 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, operating in a formation with dozens of escort vessels providing anti-aircraft defense. McCluskey's dive bombers attacked Kaga and Akagi, while dive bombers from Yorktown attacked Soryu, all 3 Japanese carriers being struck by multiple bombs within a span of approximately 5 minutes. The bombs penetrated to the hangar decks, where armed and fueled aircraft were tightly packed, detonating ammunition and fuel in catastrophic explosions that started fires the Japanese damage control parties couldn't contain. Akagi and Kaga were abandoned burning and would sink later that day. Soryu suffered similar damage and would also sink. 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier had been destroyed in 5 minutes of concentrated dive bombing. The 4th Japanese carrier, Hiryu, which had been operating separately from the other 3 carriers and hadn't been spotted by McCluskey's dive bombers, launched counterattacks against the American carriers during the afternoon of June 4th. Hiryu's aircraft severely damaged Yorktown with bomb and torpedo hits that forced her crew to abandon ship, though the carrier remained afloat and salvage efforts would continue until a Japanese submarine torpedoed and sank her 2 days later. Enterprise aircraft located Hiryu late in the afternoon and dive-bombed her, scoring hits that started fires similar to those that had doomed the other Japanese carriers. Hiryu was scuttled by Japanese destroyers early on June 5th after her crew abandoned the burning wreck. The Battle of Midway ended with all 4 Japanese fleet carriers that participated in the operation sunk along with a heavy cruiser, while American losses totaled Yorktown and a destroyer. More importantly, the Japanese Navy lost approximately 120 experienced pilots and air crew, casualties that couldn't be replaced given Japan's limited training infrastructure and growing shortage of experienced instructors who could teach the complex skills carrier aviation required. American losses were also heavy, with approximately 140 aircraft destroyed and over 300 aircrew killed. But American training programs were producing replacement pilots faster than combat consumed them, while Japanese training capacity was already inadequate for replacing normal attrition losses, let alone the catastrophic casualties suffered at Midway. Enterprise returned to Pearl Harbor after Midway for repairs and to replenish her air group, then departed again in early July for the South Pacific, where American forces were preparing to invade Guadalcanal in the first American offensive operation of the Pacific War. The Guadalcanal campaign would see Enterprise and her crew operating continuously under combat conditions for months, defending against Japanese air attacks while supporting Marine forces ashore and engaging Japanese naval forces attempting to reinforce their garrison on the island or to bombard American positions around Henderson Field. The Battle of the Eastern Solomons in August 1942 saw Enterprise Air Group sink the light carrier Ryujo, while defending against Japanese air attacks that damaged Enterprise severely enough that she had to withdraw for repairs. A Japanese dive bomber penetrated the American combat air patrol and anti-aircraft fire to plant a bomb on Enterprise's flight deck near the aft elevator, the explosion killing 44 men and starting fires that threatened the ship before damage control parties managed to extinguish them. Enterprise continued operating despite the damage, landing and launching aircraft even with a large hole in her flight deck, demonstrating the kind of determination and capability that would characterize the ship throughout the war. The Battle of Santa Cruz in October 1942 proved even more costly for Enterprise and her crew. Japanese carrier aircraft struck the ship twice with bombs, one hitting the forward part of the flight deck and penetrating to the third deck before exploding, killing 44 men and blowing a 10-foot hole in the flight deck. The second bomb hit near the forward elevator, penetrating several decks and causing extensive internal damage and fires. Enterprise was repeatedly attacked throughout the day by Japanese aircraft that somehow kept finding her, despite American attempts to move the damaged carrier away from the battle area under cover of rain squalls and low clouds. Despite taking multiple bomb hits and suffering heavy casualties, Enterprise managed to continue operating throughout the battle, recovering aircraft from the carrier Hornet. After that ship was damaged so severely she had to be abandoned and scuttled. Enterprise's damage control parties performed miracles keeping the ship operational, despite fires, flooding, and battle damage that would have disabled less well-designed ships or ships crewed by less capable sailors. By the end of the day, Enterprise had recovered not just her own aircraft, but also survivors from Hornet's air groups, and she withdrew from the battle area under her own power, heading for repairs that would take weeks to complete. The Santa Cruz battle left Enterprise as the only operational American aircraft carrier in the Pacific for several critical weeks during late October and early November 1942. When the Guadalcanal campaign reached its climax, the ship returned to the South Pacific in November with her repairs incomplete, some compartments still being worked on even as she resumed combat operations. Enterprise aircraft participated in the naval battle of Guadalcanal in mid-November, attacking Japanese battleships attempting to bombard Henderson Field and sinking or damaging several vessels in night attacks that demonstrated American carrier aviation was becoming increasingly capable of operating in darkness with the aid of radar and improved training. The strain of continuous combat operations was taking a severe toll on Enterprise's crew. Men were working 18-hour days or longer performing their regular duties while also conducting damage repairs and maintaining combat readiness. Sleep deprivation was universal, with most of the crew functioning on 4 or 5 hours of sleep per night when they were lucky. The tropical heat and humidity made working conditions in the ship's interior spaces almost unbearable, with temperatures frequently exceeding 100 degrees in engineering spaces and other areas below the waterline. Disease was rampant despite preventive measures, with malaria, dysentery, and various tropical infections affecting significant portions of the crew. The psychological stress of combat operations where Japanese submarines and aircraft could appear without warning added mental exhaustion to the physical burdens the crew endured. Every man aboard knew that carrier operations were extraordinarily dangerous and that a single bomb or torpedo hit could start fires that might consume the ship before damage control could contain them. The loss of Lexington at Coral Sea, Yorktown at Midway, Wasp to submarine attack in September, and Hornet at Santa Cruz demonstrated how vulnerable even large fleet carriers were to enemy attack, and how quickly a functioning warship could become a burning wreck that had to be abandoned. Enterprise finally returned to the United States in mid-1943 for overhaul and modernization that included upgraded radar systems, additional anti-aircraft guns, improved aircraft handling equipment, and repairs to battle damage that had been patched but never properly fixed during earlier repairs conducted under combat conditions. The crew received leave, and many of the men who had been with the ship since before Pearl Harbor rotated to other assignments or to shore duty, replaced by new crew members who would have to learn the ship and integrate into the existing crew culture that emphasized competence, mutual support, and the shared understanding that they were serving aboard the most battle-tested carrier in the fleet. The overhaul transformed Enterprise into a significantly more capable ship than she had been when commissioned. Her anti-aircraft armament had been vastly increased, with dozens of 40mm and 20mm guns providing layered defense against attacking aircraft. Her radar systems included the latest air search and fire control radars that dramatically improved her ability to detect incoming raids and to direct fighters toward threats before they could close to attack range. Her aircraft handling procedures had been refined based on combat experience, improving the rate at which aircraft could be launched and recovered, reducing the time the ship was vulnerable during flight operations. Enterprise returned to the Pacific in late 1943 and participated in the Gilbert Islands campaign that saw American forces capture Tarawa and Makan in costly amphibious assaults that demonstrated both American capability to conduct opposed landings and the challenges that heavily fortified island defenses presented. Enterprise aircraft provided close air support for Marines fighting ashore, bombing and strafing Japanese defensive positions, and maintaining combat air patrols that protected the invasion fleet from Japanese air attacks launched from bases on bypassed islands that still housed substantial Japanese aviation forces. The Marshall Islands campaign in early 1944 saw Enterprise operating as part of the fast carrier task forces that would dominate Pacific naval operations for the remainder of the war. These task forces combined multiple carriers with fast battleships, cruisers, and destroyers into formations that could project enormous air power while possessing sufficient anti-aircraft firepower and fighter coverage to defend against enemy attacks. Enterprise was one of several fleet carriers operating together, providing mutual support and allowing sustained air operations through coordinated launch and recovery schedules that kept aircraft airborne continuously, rather than all carriers conducting flight operations simultaneously. The development of effective carrier task force doctrine represented one of the American Navy's most important achievements during the Pacific War. American commanders learned through hard experience how to position carriers to support each other's operations, how to coordinate fighter coverage to protect all ships in the formation, how to manage strikes involving aircraft from multiple carriers against single targets, and how to integrate new radar technology with improved radio communications to create an integrated air defense system vastly more effective than anything possible earlier in the war. Enterprise participated in the strikes against Truk in February 1944 that destroyed Japanese naval and air power at what had been Japan's most important forward base in the Central Pacific. American carrier aircraft sank dozens of Japanese ships caught in the lagoon, destroyed hundreds of aircraft on the ground and in the air, and rendered Truk's facilities useless for supporting Japanese operations. The strikes demonstrated that American carrier task forces could strike with devastating effectiveness against even heavily defended targets, and the Japanese air power had declined to the point where even major bases couldn't defend themselves adequately against determined American attacks. The Marianas Campaign in mid-1944 brought American forces within bombing range of the Japanese home islands. Once B-29 Superfortress bombers could be based on captured islands like Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. Enterprise participated in the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, the largest carrier battle of the war, involving 9 American fleet carriers and 5 Japanese carriers, with hundreds of aircraft engaging in a day-long battle that American pilots would refer to as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, due to the one-sided nature of the aerial combat that saw Japanese aircraft shot down in enormous numbers with minimal American losses. The battle demonstrated how completely American advantages in pilot training, aircraft quality, radar technology, and fighter direction had shifted the balance of carrier aviation since the relatively even battles of 1942. Japanese pilots, many with minimal training due to Japan's collapsing pilot training program, flew into American fighter coverage that was directed by radar operators who could see the incoming raids while they were still dozens of miles away. American fighters positioned themselves advantageously and shot down Japanese aircraft in large numbers, the Japanese pilots lacking the skill and experience to evade or fight back effectively against better-trained American pilots flying superior aircraft. Enterprise air groups participated in strikes against the retreating Japanese carriers on the afternoon of June 20th, launching at extreme range in attacks that would require landing after dark if the strikes took as long as expected. The attacks sank the carrier Hio and damaged others, but the returning aircraft faced the dangerous task of finding and landing on their carriers in darkness with fuel running low after the long flight to target and back. Enterprise and the other carriers turned on their lights to help guide aircraft back despite the risk that Japanese submarines might be in the area, and searchlights swept the sky helping pilots locate the task force. Many aircraft crashed while attempting night landings or ran out of fuel and ditched, but most pilots and aircrew were recovered by destroyers searching the area through the night. The Philippines campaign, beginning in October 1944, brought Enterprise into action during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle of World War II and one of the largest naval battles in history. Enterprise aircraft participated in strikes against Japanese battleships, cruisers, and destroyers attempting to attack American amphibious forces in Leyte Gulf, and Enterprise fighters defended against kamikaze attacks that were beginning to appear with increasing frequency as Japanese commanders, desperate for any way to inflict casualties on American forces, turned to suicide tactics that would characterize the final year of the Pacific War. Enterprise survived the Philippines campaign, despite numerous close calls with kamikaze aircraft that American fighters or anti-aircraft fire shot down just before they could crash into the ship. The carrier's crew became intimately familiar with the particular terror of watching Japanese aircraft diving toward the ship, knowing that the pilot had no intention of pulling out, and that only destroying the aircraft completely would prevent it from hitting. The improved anti-aircraft firepower that Enterprise had received during her overhaul proved its worth. Repeatedly, as concentrated fire from dozens of guns created a defensive bubble that most kamikazes couldn't penetrate despite determined attempts. The Iwo Jima and Okinawa campaigns in early 1945 saw Enterprise operating almost continuously for months, providing air support for ground forces fighting some of the most intense and costly battles of the Pacific War. Enterprise aircraft bombed Japanese positions ashore, flew combat air patrols protecting the fleet from air attack, and conducted anti-submarine patrols searching for Japanese submarines attempting to attack the vast fleet of ships supporting the invasions. The operational tempo was exhausting for the crew, with flight operations continuing around the clock and with every man aboard understanding that Japanese attacks could come at any time without warning. On May 14, 1945, during operations off Okinawa, a Japanese kamikaze aircraft managed to evade the combat air patrol and anti-aircraft fire to crash into Enterprise's forward elevator, penetrating to the hangar deck before the bomb it carried detonated. The explosion killed 14 men, started fires in the hangar, and blew the forward elevator several hundred feet into the air before it crashed back onto the flight deck. The damage was severe enough that Enterprise had to withdraw from the combat zone and steam to Puget Sound Navy Yard in Washington State for repairs that would take months to complete. The repairs were still underway when Japan surrendered in August 1945, ending Enterprise's war after nearly 4 years of almost continuous combat operations. The ship had participated in virtually every major carrier battle of the Pacific War except the Coral Sea. Her aircraft had sunk or damaged hundreds of Japanese ships and destroyed thousands of Japanese aircraft. Her crew had earned the carrier the Presidential Unit Citation, the Navy Unit Commendation, and 20 battle stars, more than any other American warship during World War II. Enterprise had become the most decorated ship in the United States Navy, a distinction she would retain throughout her remaining service and beyond into retirement. The ship that had escaped destruction at Pearl Harbor through fortunate timing had survived the entire war despite being hit by bombs and kamikaze aircraft multiple times, despite operating in combat zones where other carriers were sunk or heavily damaged, and despite serving almost continuously without the extended periods in port for rest and maintenance that other carriers received. The survival seemed almost miraculous to the crew members who had served aboard during the worst battles and who had seen sister ships destroyed while Enterprise somehow kept operating despite damage that should have been fatal. The post-war years brought difficult questions about what should happen to Enterprise and the other carriers that had won the Pacific War. Many newer carriers had been built during the war, and more were under construction, incorporating all the lessons learned from combat operations and technological advances developed during wartime. Enterprise was now 7 years old, damaged from years of combat service, and designed according to pre-war specifications that were already obsolete compared to newer vessels. The Navy had to decide whether to invest in extensive modernization that would bring Enterprise up to current standards or to retire the ship and focus resources on newer vessels. Enterprise was decommissioned in February 1947 and placed in reserve, officially awaiting a decision about her future, but realistically unlikely to ever return to active service given the number of newer carriers available and the extensive work that would be required to modernize her to post-war standards. Various proposals were made over the following years to preserve Enterprise as a museum ship, given her extraordinary combat record and her symbolic importance as the most successful American carrier of World War II. However, all these proposals foundered on the cost of preserving such a large ship and the difficulty of finding a suitable permanent location. In 1958, with Enterprise still sitting in reserve and deteriorating from years of inactivity, the Navy made the decision to scrap the ship despite protests from veterans organizations and from many Americans who believed the most decorated ship in Navy history deserved preservation. Enterprise was sold for scrap and broken up beginning in 1960. Her metal recycled and her physical existence ended despite her historical importance. Only a few artifacts and her name survived, the name being transferred to the Navy's first nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, CVN-65, commissioned in 1961. The decision to scrap Enterprise rather than preserve her as a museum has been widely criticized over the decades since, with many historians and veterans arguing that the ship's combat record and historical significance justified the cost of preservation. But the decision reflected practical considerations about preservation costs, suitable locations, and the competing priorities for Navy resources during the late 1950s when nuclear-powered ships represented the future, and World War II seemed increasingly distant in memory. The loss of Enterprise as a physical artifact means that her story must be preserved through documents, photographs, and the memories of those who served aboard her rather than through the ship herself. The crew members who served aboard Enterprise during the war, particularly those who were with the ship during the desperate battles of 1942, when her survival often seemed miraculous, and when she was sometimes the only American carrier operating in the Pacific, carried lifelong pride in having served aboard the most successful carrier of the war. They formed veteran associations, held reunions, and worked to preserve Enterprise's history and combat record for future generations, who would never see the ship that had become legendary, through 4 years of nearly continuous combat operations. Enterprise's combat record and survival through years of intensive operations while other carriers were sunk demonstrated not just the ship's capability, but more fundamentally, the quality of her crew and their commitment to keeping the ship operating regardless of damage, exhaustion, or the dangers they faced. Damage control parties who fought fires and flooding while under attack, aviation personnel who serviced in armed aircraft while bombs exploded nearby, gunners who fired at attacking aircraft until their guns ran dry or they were killed at their stations, and all the other crew members performing essential but unglamorous tasks that kept the ship functioning as an effective warship together, created the combat effectiveness that made Enterprise legendary. The technological evolution that Enterprise represented was equally significant. The ship that escaped Pearl Harbor in December 1941 with primitive radar, limited anti-aircraft armament, and doctrine based on pre-war theories about carrier operations evolved into a vastly more capable vessel by 1945 through continuous improvements driven by combat experience and technological development. The radar that could barely detect aircraft at 20 miles in 1941 had been replaced by systems that provided clear pictures of air activity over 100 miles away. The anti-aircraft armament that consisted mainly of a few 5-inch guns had expanded to include dozens of automatic weapons, creating layered defense in depth. The fighter direction procedures that barely existed in 1941 had developed into sophisticated systems, allowing precise control of multiple fighter divisions simultaneously. Enterprise's story illustrated the broader transformation of the United States Navy during World War II, from a force that entered the war with significant weaknesses and outdated doctrine to one that by 1945 had achieved clear technological and operational superiority over every potential opponent. The carriers that survived from the pre-war and early war years, few though they were, represented living laboratories where tactics and technology evolved through practical combat experience rather than peacetime theorizing. Every battle taught lessons that informed subsequent operations, and the rapid implementation of these lessons gave American forces cumulative advantages that Japanese forces could never match given their deteriorating situation and declining resources. The veterans of Enterprise and the other carriers that fought through the Pacific War understood that they had participated in one of the most important campaigns in American military history, the campaign that had defeated Japanese naval and air power and opened the way for the eventual invasion and occupation of Japan that never had to occur, because atomic bombs and Soviet entry into the war produced surrender before invasion became necessary. They had fought in conditions that tested human endurance to its limits, had watched friends die in accidents and combat, had experienced fear and exhaustion and doubt about whether they would survive, and had somehow kept functioning as effective warships through everything the Japanese could throw at them. Enterprise earned her reputation and her battle honors through the accumulated efforts of the thousands of officers and men who served aboard her during the war years, each contributing their specialized skills and their determination to the larger effort of keeping the ship operational and effective. The mechanics who kept aircraft engines running despite spare part shortages and tropical heat. The ordnancemen who armed bombs and torpedoes and loaded ammunition under conditions that were always dangerous and sometimes terrifying when enemy attack was imminent. The cooks and bakers who fed the crew day after day, despite limited ingredients and the constant motion of the ship. The engineering personnel who kept the boilers and turbines running continuously for weeks at a time, providing the power that moved the ship and generated electricity for everything aboard. The medical personnel who treated the wounded after attacks and who dealt with disease and injuries that were inevitable consequences of operating a large ship under combat conditions. All these contributions and dozens of others combined to create the combat effectiveness that made Enterprise successful and that kept her operating when other ships failed. The legacy of Enterprise extended beyond her specific combat record to influence American naval thinking about carrier operations, ship design, crew training, and damage control procedures. Lessons learned aboard Enterprise during her combat operations informed the design of Essex-class carriers that were built during the war and that incorporated improvements based on combat experience. Enterprise's survival, despite taking several bomb hits and being struck by kamikaze aircraft, validated design features like armored flight decks, redundant systems, and compartmentalization that could contain damage and keep ships operational even after suffering hits that would have been fatal to less well-designed vessels. The carrier doctrine that emerged from Pacific War experience, doctrine that Enterprise helped develop through practical combat operations, would guide American naval aviation for decades afterward and would influence carrier operations through the Cold War and beyond. The lessons about the importance of fighter direction, about radar integration with combat operations, about coordination among multiple carriers operating together, about damage control priorities, about countless other operational and tactical details, all were learned through practical experience by ships like Enterprise and were codified into doctrine that shaped subsequent naval operations. Enterprise represented the best of American naval tradition, combining technological capability with human skill, courage, and determination to achieve combat effectiveness that exceeded what her designers had imagined when they drew the plans and what peacetime observers would have believed possible if told what the ship would accomplish during 4 years of war. Her story is fundamentally a story about the people who served aboard her and who made the ship into something greater than the sum of her guns, armor, and aircraft. The physical ship is gone, broken up for scrap decades ago, despite her historical significance. But the story of what Enterprise achieved and what she represented endures as one of the most remarkable chapters in American naval history and in the broader story of the Pacific War.